to push it to record. Wow. Thank you, Ellen. So first of all, thanks so much for joining us for tonight's event to talk about civic engagement, particularly as it relates to climate change. I think some of you have seen from the way in which we've announced this event that it's really a part of the priority that we have set as a board for our chapter this year and probably next about social justice. We've had several speakers and events focused on social justice, and obviously environmental justice fits in that rubric, but we're interested in really trying to understand, especially when there's more and more attention finally and hopefully being given to climate change, that we really need to make sure we're listening to all voices, particularly those voices that are often not heard. And we want to get a sense as to how do we reach out to sort of all populations to ensure that people who are often underrepresented get a voice in what's happening, what are the issues, where the money should be spent, how should the money be spent, all of those things. So we naturally decided that we needed Carolyn Lukensmeyer on this call because she is, in my opinion, one of the preeminent experts as it relates to civic engagement. If you don't know it, she is the first and I guess founding executive director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona. I just moved my mom from Southern Arizona. If I hadn't moved her, maybe I could come and visit you. Anyway, this organization is really about working to reduce what they're saying is political dysfunction and incivility in our political system, which are really powerful words, but really important words, I think, for where we are today. And I met her when she was the president of America Speaks, which is what was a nonprofit organization that was promoting civic engagement with both citizens and leaders on a broad range of topics. I got to actually participate in one of those civic engagement efforts that she held in Chicago around youth health, especially obesity. And so it was a great opportunity for me to see what she has been all about for many years in terms of reaching out to populations that really need to be heard. She's also a National Academy for Public Administration Fellow. In that role, she was on a working group that was involved in developing new approaches to public governance and engagement. And so she'll be actually referring to one of the reports that that group did as a part of her remarks. Kerry Beach, hold on, there's another person I need to admit here. Kerry Beach is the division chief for Alexandria City's Neighborhood Planning and Community Development Division. And when I looked up that division, I got a little bit of a sense that what they're all about is community-based long-range planning and analysis. And it's related to both physical development as well as what and how we want to appear, how we appear as a city in terms of what we develop. And I know she's and her group develops and implements the city's interdepartmental long-range planning work program. What that says to me is, and what I'm interested in part of her remarks, is how they work together across silos, across organizations to try to reach the needs of the community, as well as trying to understand how we make sure that the community's voice is being heard through those departments. And she's been there since 2003. So she's been there for a while. So she has a real background in understanding where the city has been, where the city's really trying to go. Oh, good, another person's joining us. And she's an urban planner. She has a master's degree in urban and environmental planning, as well as history and Spanish as an undergraduate degree. And the third person on our panel is Ellen Egerton. She has been the sustainability coordinator for the City of Alexandria since 2017. And in that role, she has been working with, again, the city departments to coordinate and update the city's environmental action plan and implement sustainability across the whole of the city. Now, what I found interesting was before she came to the City of Alexandria, she worked for Fairfax County. She was what they called a green building ombudsman and a nonprofit ombudsman. And when I read the description of what she did in that role, one of the things that stuck out for me was that she was responsible for making sure that she was mentoring her colleagues across the county to engage in regional, not just county, but regional sustainability goals. And she participated in a number of committees that were cross-agency, so that, again, they had a perspective that was not just across the county, but across the region, state, and even at the national level. And so that's something that actually, I think, will contribute greatly to your experience, will contribute greatly to the conversation. And she's a for real professional engineer, licensed mechanical engineer. So she brings that whole sort of hard science aspect to this work, not just what we are talking about in terms of the interactions that are so critical to making government work well. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to have each person talk for a few minutes. They've each got a set of slides, which will be available on our website in addition to this recording, hopefully. So we'll have each of them present their information about where they are, what they're working on in the context of this topic. And then we want to open it up to questions so that people feel that they have an opportunity to interact with you guys and to be able to get much more clarity maybe on the things that they're interested in. So with that, I'm going to start with Carolyn, and I'm going to open up her slides and ask Carolyn to go.
Well, Judy, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. As you described, citizen engagement has been my passion for almost 30 years. And I did have the opportunity to serve in two national, if you want to go to the next slide, two national commissions that have happened in, well, let me back up. If I were going to put two words out that are the biggest threat to where we are in our democracy, it would be trust and truth. We all know the data that since the 70s, trust in all institutions in this country has dropped and dropped and dropped. I think finally Congress hit the lowest that's been hit at 9% a year and a half ago. However, in the last particularly 7 years, what we've now begun to see is that we don't trust each other. For many years, that was the only data point that stayed above 50%. But we're now also at the place where people who live together, work together, are also lacking trust in each other. Two national commissions took on this topic pretty head on. If you want to advance the slide. And you'll have these slides. I highly recommend both documents to you. One is a working group of NAPA, which followed up on the 12 challenges facing the next administration to particularly work on this issue of the relationship between government and the citizens. In that report, we made recommendations to the executive branch, both White House and agency, to Congress, to state and local government, and to cross-sector leadership teams in communities about actions they could take to increase trust. In our common purpose, there were 6 strategies, 31 recommendations that actually create a blueprint for reform and protection of democracy as we are currently experiencing it so under threat. In both of these reports, one of the recommendations was the utilization of a method of citizen participation called citizen assemblies. And that is actually what I'm going to focus my conversation around: climate change as a specific topic on which to engage the public. Next slide. The first citizen assembly was put in play in 2004 by the premier of the country, of the province, British Columbia in Canada. It was well researched and evaluated and has led to a decade and a half of more implementation and research. Next slide, please. The bad news is, and now I'm going to speak nationally for a minute, the US is behind other democracies in engaging citizens on climate change, and it is significantly behind. Britain, actually working with an advocacy group called Extinction Rebellion, held citizen assemblies in 5 regions in the country, and then actually also held it nationally. The most effective version of it, probably in terms of actual change on climate to date, is the French National Citizens Assembly, which Macron put in place, fully bringing the advocates to the table to both figure out how it would be done, how people would be selected. There is some disappointment in it not going as far as citizens recommended, but a real stake was put in the ground about how to do large-scale citizen engagement on the national level. Next slide, please. In the US specifically, there is actually some good news as well. There are 2 examples, and there are many more examples locally, but in terms of the utilization of citizen assemblies, the state of Washington actually did that a year and a half ago to prep their political class that was going to be at the Glasgow summit as to what people in the state of Washington thought. This one was kind of dear to my heart, because it happened in part because of a training program that NICD created for state legislators, which actually taught them how to deal once again across the aisle. Next slide, please. Currently in the US, New York City is actually developing an approach to bring a citizens assembly. They were far down the road. The mayor's now changing, so they're regrouping to begin the effort again. That slide is a photo of the report that they've developed and they've taken to council members and the mayor. And I will get that URL to Judy also so it can be put in the notes. Next slide, please. The additional good news is, as we're going to hear in depth about Alexandria, many local jurisdictions in the United States are beginning to engage their citizen in the creation of significant climate action plans. And at the local level, the perspective has to be both what's urgent, but how do you put that in a long-term perspective, which I know you're going to really hear in depth from Kerry. When Judy invited me to do this, one of the things she asked me to speak most in depth about, which I am delighted to do, is the issue about how do you ensure that the citizens and residents in your community who are traditionally most marginalized actually are at the table for these conversations, particularly those that are going to lead to public policy decisions that determine the allocation of funds. And in the arena of climate, you all know our history. We have not typically engaged marginalized groups. And in fact, we don't need to do that negative history. The bottom line is, it's time to start again. And I'm going to spend the rest of my time with you trying to be very specific about the methods that have been well proven to engage everyone in your community. Next slide, please. The goals of citizen engagement and the way we're talking about them are to discover the shared or collective priorities of citizens and residents of your jurisdiction. You know, one of the disservices we do to the public when we're governing, and at the national level, it's rife, which is the only way we ask questions is polling. And polling only gives you an aggregate picture of individual preferences at a moment in time. And what a policymaker really needs is access to a stable public opinion that represents the collective priorities of the citizens and residents of that jurisdiction. Essential also to this, for this to work, is it has to ensure that decision makers are influenced by those shared priorities. Now, never would you expect that everything that comes out of citizen engagement would be adapted by decision makers. But there has to be the involvement of decision makers all along for credibility, and there has to be a demonstration of the fact that what the citizens have put heart and soul into actually has shifted the perspective of decision makers. Next slide, please. So, in terms of the outreach to marginalized citizen engagement, Step one is the assessment to ensure that the relevant government bodies actually know the whole community that has to be represented in the process. I'll give you an example in mental health work that we did after the tragic death of so many kids in Newport School District. We were in Sacramento, California, and some of the city's agencies didn't even have the contact data of the most recent influx of Somalian refugees into that community. So for a government to actually know that they have access to all of the subpopulations requires an ongoing assessment of who is in our community. The other principle, the other core principle, just like think when someone invites you to do something that's out of your wheelbox, you wouldn't ordinarily do it. You might see it on an, you might get an email about it. You might get a flyer in the mail about it. But in the end, your choice to actually participate will come down to the fact that you have been invited by someone you trust. When we did 5,000 people representative of New York City and the region around where people work in the city after 9/11 in New York, one of the things I'm most proud of those 5,000 people, we had almost 500 illegal immigrants sitting at the table. Illegal immigrants were the lower income people that were the highest percentage of people who died in 9/11 in the towers. The way we managed to do that was we sat at the table with the governor and the mayor as they invited the social service agencies that were servicing those people. So the Spaces of America Speaks people became known and trusted by the service organizations that were in contact with those people. Then in the end, that's who invited them. So supports that are necessary for lower income, more marginalized populations. Transportation needs to be provided. Childcare may need to be provided. Food may need to be provided. Multilingual materials prior to the event. Simultaneous interpretation during the event. And most critical is the protection of personal data. Those 500 illegal immigrants who came to the Jacob Javits Center to give their notions about what should be done in rebuilding knew that we never had their names and we never had their addresses. The only people that had their names and addresses were the trusted service organizations who got them to the table. I cannot overemphasize the importance of that principle. Next slide, please. Additionally, they have to have access to trusted factual materials. Now, in this horrendous situation we're in, where people get their news and their information from different sources to validate what they already believe, and climate change is one of the most difficult. I imagine that Kerry will speak somewhat about that, or I can come back to it in the Q&A, but it has to, the engagement has to be supported by trusted factual materials. There needs to be excellent professional facilitation, both for the whole group, and that's if it's on Zoom and in breakout rooms, or if it's in person in local localities around the community. The facilitation has to be at the plenary level and at each table. There has to be the appropriate visible involvement of decision makers, and decision makers have to be willing to make a risk, to make a statement publicly during the process at the right time. And that the thing that's least understood about how some of this work has been done traditionally is that there also needs to be options for sustained participant engagement. That might be something as simple as learning how to get to be part of the cleanup crew in your neighborhood that does work in parks and streets that won't get done in any other way, to say it most simply. At the national level on climate change, it is to ensure that every single person who participates in the conversation actually knows an organization to stay connected to after the participation. Next slide, please. If we actually do all this well, we will have made a significant contribution to increasing the public's trust, both in government and in each other. We didn't used to have to worry so much about the in each other, but the way it's now common for people to vilify and demonize each other, and this happens on the issue of climate change, because we hold a different position. Once you've created a safe space, you have a well-designed process, excellent material. In our experience, it takes people only about 45 minutes to discover that they actually have more in common at the values and vision level than separates them. That gives them enough relationship connection to then move into the more difficult parts of the conversation in terms of options. Now, there's a big difference in terms of thinking of large-scale engagement at the national level and how this actually operates in a community like Alexandria. And I'm thrilled to be part of this evening in terms of you getting great detail from Kerry, and then we'll have a chance to come back and look at the interrelationship. Thank you, and I hope I did the time limit right.
Thank you. So now, Kerry, I think you can share screen, right? So,
yep, let's see if it's working. Move this over. So can you all see my screen?
I can, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Carolyn. That was really interesting and fun to connect with you again after you helped us with what I'm about to talk about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of give an intro on this, on our civic engagement sort of policy and program that we have called What's Next Alexandria. Some examples of a few planning projects that we've done since then. And then Ellen, my colleague, is going to talk about the climate change planning and sustainability work that she is doing and how community engagement is working there. So I'm going to, I've got like 3 keyboards and 2 monitors. So let's see if I can figure all of this out. Apparently not. Okay. In 2013, Alexandria was feeling like the woman in the top left corner. Pretty much everybody in government and then the community was feeling that way. We had just come off of 2 really rancorous public planning projects, the Beauregard plan and the waterfront process. And both of them were just so divisive and fell into many of the pitfalls that Carolyn was talking about. And so when those 2 finally were approved, City Council asked us to take a pause and sort of regroup, reboot, and come up with a process that we worked on with the sort of a community engagement process to talk about community engagement and come up with our approach going forward. I'm gonna there, that's better. So we did that, and this process was about a year long. We had a kickoff where Carolyn came and was our keynote speaker, and very important to this effort was making sure we had representation from the city at large, as opposed to the folks that we had been hearing from the most. And we knew that in order to both inform this civic engagement planning effort, but also future planning efforts, we were going to need to really expand engagement. We were going to need to make it easier for the folks who hadn't been participating and more meaningful. And so we, through this year-long process, we had a number of large events where people from all over the community sat around tables and discussed, okay, what are going to be our principles of engagement? How are we going to, what are going to be the fundamentals? And so these are the principles that our community came up with. They're all, pretty straightforward and what you would hope and expect to see as sort of the the foundation for civic engagement. We also, the community, so in addition to the principles, the community also came up with sort of a standard framework, sort of a process for planning processes. So sort of in other words, so that we have a shared expectation of how these planning processes will go, how, so that we're not doing it differently in different departments, so the community has the same understanding as the government, and also looking at ways that all of the different tools that we can use to broaden and expand participation. And that includes, as Carolyn was mentioning, using trusted messengers, using community leaders that are already out there and have relationships, using service providers. That was a really great way of getting folks to participate in this particular planning process. And essentially, so with these 9 principles, with sort of a standard framework and shared expectations, the city came up with basically a civic engagement policy, and it's an actual resolution. So it's a binding policy for the city, and it essentially sort of makes the handbook part of the fundamentals of what we do. A few different planning processes that I want to highlight that came after the community engagement. The first one is Route 1 South Housing Affordability Strategy. So this was in a community in sort of the south of Old Town, where there were several blocks of committed affordable housing that were about to lose their affordability and were at risk of displacing all of the residents who lived there. So this process was really important to ensure that the people that would be most impacted by these changes would not just have a seat at the table, but be engaged and participating. And we used every tool in the book to make sure that they were engaged. And so that was, as Carolyn mentioned, transportation, food, childcare, interpretation. We also held some of the events in their lobby of their buildings or in the coffee shop owned by someone who also was from that, who spoke Amharic and could be another connection to the community. We used Legos so that we were doing hands-on work to help make this a much more understandable, because one of the tools that we needed to use to preserve the housing is density. And density is a hard one both to understand and also to accept, especially in a community like Old Town. And so the Legos helped us sort of make it a little more understandable for everyone, and to understand that if these units were to be preserved, there would need to be additional density. Let me just check and make sure I'm covering all of my the tools that we used here. We also created a few short videos to help make things a little more understandable, and for those people who couldn't necessarily make it to events. But it really was gratifying and excellent to see these conversations happening among different residents within the neighborhood, and really having the important conversations that needed to be had. We also did have on-site or neighborhood tours so that people could walk around and ask questions and et cetera. Another recent project where we brought a lot of these engagement and communications tools to bear was our Census Complete Count work. And again, in that case, we were relying on, we were doing this in 4 languages. So English, Amharic, Arabic, and Spanish, everything. from videos to publications to meetings. In this case, we really were relying on our trusted messengers and service providers. It was an excellent way to make sure that we were getting the message out there. We were also working on simplifying our message. So it was very clear that by participating, it was safe, and it's easy and it's fast, and you're ensuring that your community gets the funding and the representation that it needed. And we were super successful. We got a 100% complete count, and we were the first in Northern Virginia to get to that point by the October 15th deadline. So that was really great to see the engagement across the whole community. Whoops, wrong keyboard. The most recent plan we've been working on is the Arlandria Chiralagua plan, and this is a neighborhood in the northeastern section of the city. It's about 65% of the neighborhood identifies as Hispanic or Latino. About 45% of the neighborhood is households earn $50,000 a year or less, compared to about 20% in the city as a whole. And here our big focus was affordable housing. As you know, this is close to where Amazon and the North Potomac Yard Virginia Tech Innovation Campus will be, the new metro station. And so the concerns about the market pushing the lower priced housing out was a big one, and the residents' fear of being displaced and gentrification. And so here we focused on affordable housing from the outset. And again, we started using all of these tools that I've been talking about to make sure that the people most impacted would be engaged and a part of the process. Here we decided to do a Spanish first process. So everything was in Spanish first, and then we had it translated into English as well. So you'll see if you go to our website, it's Spanish and English on the same page. We also were, the pandemic happened during this planning process. And so right before it happened, we were able to have some meetings where we were all around tables together, but for a large portion of this process, we had to come up with different approaches. So those were meetings in parking lots with the chairs spread apart. It was more remote. So we would have, for example, you'll see that A-frame out in the sidewalk with a QR code so that people could learn about the process and provide their feedback. We used WhatsApp, which is a common app that the residents in the community use. We put signs up on that wrapped light poles. We had videos, and then we were just out in the community at bus stops, laundromats, playgrounds. So we had to engage the community in a different way, both because of the pandemic, but also because this is a community that doesn't have the time or luxury necessarily to come to meetings. And so this was a great way of ensuring that we were meeting them where they were and involving them in the decision-making and talking about the needs for the future. This is just a sort of impact in numbers of what we did in Arlandria, all of the various translations and different ways that we met with them. This plan actually is going to City Council on Saturday, so it's exciting time here in the planning department. One thing I wanted to highlight was, oops, wrong computer. The pandemic and how some of the silver linings, as I think I alluded to a little bit, but not just in this area, but also in other areas, we ended up reaching, because of the pandemic and having to do some of these Zoom meetings, we ended up being able to engage people who typically, don't participate because they've got kids or, you know, other requirements that keep them from actually going to meetings, we found that we were getting a lot of new names that were participating for various planning projects, which is exciting because that's one of the biggest challenges that we run into is, you know, having the same folks participate plan after plan. You know, there are some efficiencies to be achieved in that too, because we're not dealing with meeting logistics and traveling and setup and all of those things. Obviously, there are things that you sacrifice, of course, when you're doing everything on Zoom, as we all know. It's not quite the same, but there are. I just wanted to bring up some of those sort of silver linings that happen. We also, I think, just demonstrating to the community that engagement can still be transparent and successful online, and using existing technology that we've all had for so long, but people never really, I think, trusted or believed that it was worthy or possible to do some of this engagement online. It's not for every stage of a process, and you wouldn't want everything to be online or virtual, but it certainly had some positive aspects that have been very helpful to our department and the work that we do, and engaging different portions of the community. And we could do it in Spanish and we could do it in English, and it in some ways was very helpful to be able to have that as a resource during the pandemic. And that's about all I wanted to cover, just sort of that intro on what's Next Alexandria, some of the planning we've been doing since then. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ellen, if I can figure out how to stop sharing.
Judy's going to stop sharing, and Judy will take over.
Yeah, and I'm going to turn it over to Ellen to talk a little bit about the climate change and sustainability planning that she's been doing to sort of tie it all together.
Well, I'll go ahead and introduce myself while Judy's sharing my slides. So again, I'm the sustainability coordinator for the City of Alexandria. And kind of as an understanding, I think what Carolyn said, facts are important. So in my position as a mechanical engineer for over 40 years, you know, I started my career as an energy conservation engineer. And this is really one of the benefits to the city of having an engineer in my position, is that we really work from a position of facts and hopefully gain that trust. So when I started as an energy conservation engineer in 1978, heat pumps were the new technology and encouraged by the utility. And now we know how to do them better, and they are designed better. And now I work across all those departments in the city, and to engage them in a coordinated effort to implement our environmental action plan. So I'm going to speak about how our environmental action plan went through an engagement process. But I also want to say that we're also doing another prioritization and focus plan that's called our Energy and Climate Change Action Plan Update. And this will help prioritize some of the actions in our environmental action plan and also fill in any gaps. Even though our environmental action plan was only adopted in 2019, we're hearing from the community that they want to prioritize the emergent priorities in climate change. So in that sense, what we're seeing is that we're responding for people by really recognizing that they need to know more. But the other thing we do as part of this, and this is the image on the right of this, I want to give the community a robust set of tools and guidance that they can use as part of that update and living and working priorities to be on a more sustainable path for the future of the city and their own families. So giving people these tools, such as a thermal camera, allows people to see the facts and the truths for themselves. And our sustainable success depends on significant community participation. Next slide, Judy. So in order to really see one of the issues of engaging sustainability with people, it's a lot to comprehend. So sustainability and climate change issues are really the same effort with different names. The City of Alexandria is making a journey together with the community for a sustainable future. And we use our plans, such as the Environmental Action Plan, as a roadmap. And we use the additional, more detailed plans to keep that planning process and sustainability updated and involved from the community. So I will say to you that a sustainable path is not a straight line. You just don't get from your goals and targets and get there. It's frequently staggered steps with changes along the path, and the community will be a factor and engage and make that effort. So without the community's participation, we couldn't get there. But also, the community's participation isn't an assumed thing. We have to engage them on all the different criteria: environmental, economic, social, and also the other part of that that contributes is the federal policy. So we talk to people when we're engaging them that saying engaging with us is not the only thing. We need to still engage at a federal and a state level to get all those players involved. One example of that at the state level is people being engaged to get our electric grid to become more renewable. That doesn't happen just from the city's contribution. So we do have enthusiastic people in the city who do engage at the state level. I myself am very involved in the Building Energy Conservation Code at the state and national level. So I think that to help people on their journey, we start with a basic understanding of what sustainability is and what the science is, and go from there. Next slide. And I probably should have mentioned on that back slide. Can you go one back, Judy? I probably should have mentioned that that diagram on the right shows people factually that 96% of the emissions in the city come from the community, and only 4% are controlled by the government. So even if we wanted to talk about climate change and people thought the city could do it all, this lays out the facts that the city can't do it alone. Next slide. Thank you, Judy. Okay, so a little bit of background. The City of Alexandria has been involved in sustainability for a long, long time. So it has really grown from the 1970s when it created an environmental policy commission. And that is a group of residents who are on a commission who advise the city council and advise city staff and give us guidance and give us opinions. And so that commission process is part of a way that the community can participate on, on a regular basis with the staff and with the community and with city council on a variety of topics that come before them. So we became an eco-city in 2007. We developed a vision of an eco-city charter. All of these things, like Kerry mentioned, involved public processes. None of these were done in a vacuum. They were really done as a public process. We had an environmental action plan and a green building policy in 2009. We updated both of those things in 2019, and they are our new roadmap of goals going forward. And there are other programs and policies that are too numerous to list, but they support and enhance that journey on sustainability. But each of those plans, each of those documents is a public process. Okay, just kind of give you some format here, and I don't know where everybody's from. Alexandria is a 15 square mile tidal riverfront city with regular nuisance flooding that affects businesses, homes, and city operations. We are a highly mobile, culturally diverse community of about 155,000 and a mixture of really urban and suburban adjacent to the nation's capital. We are an active participant in regional efforts and partnerships. We have a complex and common transportation system with subway, bus, bike share, scooters, walking paths, biking paths, a subway system, and commuters who go through our city. We have regional air quality issues and regional partnerships for municipal infrastructure. That means that we get our water from Fairfax County, and we have a waste to energy plant that we share with Arlington. So really, all of these things in the city are impacted by actions not only within the city, but we have to collaborate and work with our partners regionally. Now, I'll just say one thing about the City of Alexandria. We have a Dillon rule. That means it's like a mother may I rule. So you only in the city can do what the state has given you the authority to do. And I won't go into any more detail on that. Okay, next slide. We have an engagement process that we went through, and the Environmental Policy Commission was very actively and is always actively involved in any of our environmental issues. And we worked with them, and when we were doing the update of the Environmental Action Plan, we met back, this is in 2019 before COVID, we met in small groups and talked through each of the different topics in our Environmental Action Plan. After we'd talked through with staff and the Environmental Policy Commission, we then opened the process up and had an Eco-City Cafe. We took the 10 topics in the Environmental Action Plan, had 10 tables, and we sat around about 10 people at a table. There were about 100 people at the event. And people got to discuss that topic. And then we changed 3 times, like musical chairs, and people could then engage on another topic by going to a different table topic. Along that way, we also had open houses. And for all of the Eco-City Cafe and open houses, before we had Zoom and all these different platforms, I used Facebook Live for remote participation. So when someone wanted to participate remotely, I had to have someone sitting at a table with a computer, taking those comments live, and then writing that comment on an index card for me. And then I read that aloud at the meeting. This was the pre-Zoom kind of era. Then we also had an Eco-City Summit, which is really, we had greater participation, but it was more further along in the process. So what we did is had people vote the old-fashioned way with stick-on dots, and they voted in support of different actions, and we got a prioritization from the community that way. And we also had at that Eco-City Summit a child's activity center, so that people who, it wasn't really for really young kids, but people who really wouldn't have been able to find childcare could bring their children along, and we had an activity for them. Now we have an ongoing engagement process. We have an Eco-City Academy, and I host that academy twice a year. What we do is we have about 20 volunteers sign up for the academy. They go through 6-week sessions, and we use this Eco-City Academy to create Eco-City ambassadors. And they can reach deeper into the community and educate the community more one-on-one, and they commit to volunteering 10 hours. Right now, we're having an ECAP, Energy and Climate Change Action Plan update, and we're using a task force, and now it's during COVID time, so we're Zooming everything, and they're helping to guide that update of that process. So these processes all were about sustainability and climate change. So we really have engaged a lot of people along the way. And this allows us to also leverage our resources when we work with our regional partners and reach out to the community to get participation. Limited staff resources cannot reach everybody. So we need now our new ambassadors, as we graduate more and more of them, to help leverage our staff resources by providing sustainable messaging deeper into their communities. Next slide. So I want to say that we did have some engagement challenges. COVID moved everything up, almost everything online, and it had pros and cons for equity. We were not able to meet people where they are. We don't have the staff or the resources to do that anyway in our department of the Office of Environmental Quality. We don't have the same staff level that planning and zoning where Kerry works does. But even though we couldn't meet people where they are, we could engage more people to participate because it was online. And the online gave people who, I think Kerry did mention this, who may have childcare issues, who have new babies, as one of your participants was holding a 10-month, they can participate at more things because it is online. And it also helps to leverage our staff resources. My being able to even be here is made more available by the fact that we're doing this online. I don't have to travel to your site, and everybody who's traveling there would use energy and gas and whatever that is. So for me, online Zooming is a more sustainable option. But the downside is it's difficult to convey complex issues about the environment. And messaging is challenging. I mean, it's hard for me to, without a lot more time as well, to explain some difficult concept like why heating and ventilating and air conditioning equipment sizing is an issue and how that affects mold. And also to include talking about comfort. Climate changes and more intense storms are unpredictable and scattered, but these concepts all are related, and it's a lot to convey. So I would say one of the engagement challenges is the information is hard to convey. So I try my best. That's why I love things like the tools I give loan out from the library and thermal imaging. So I would say that it's more comfortable, for instance, and cost less to live in a very energy efficient home, and the air is cleaner. That's a better way of describing it than getting into the technological details. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we have an EcoCity Academy. So this is another way that we use to convey the huge amount of information that is related to climate change in a way that people can absorb more slowly. So with this academy, we have 6 weeks of classes. Each of them is 90 minutes. Is that right? Yeah, an hour and a half. And sometimes stretches into 2 hours because we added a half an hour before the class of just networking among the participants, which they really wanted. So we talk about overall the background science, overall what sustainability means. And we use subject matter experts from the staff and a few of our outside partners, such as the Sanitary Sewer Authority. So our first class was on solid waste, and there's a lot to cover in solid waste. There are those things like first, reduce the amount of stuff, reduce your amount of waste, reduce your amount of packaging. And then there's reuse, donate to a reuse facility. We have a reuse directory on our website, and I would encourage you all to use that and our what goes where link. And then we have a lot to talk about in recycling. And we have a lot of successes about that, but people have to optionally, for instance, engage in our glass only recycling. We have big purple bins around the city. Week 2, we talk about stormwater, and we talk about the sanitary sewer system. And we talk about, what you can do within your own home with a rain barrel. And we talk about, planting trees and plants. Week 3, we go over green buildings and open space. So there's a lot to package in all this. Then we talk about transportation and air quality. This is where we talk about how our dash bus system is free, and air quality comes about by using electric vehicles and not having emissions in the city. Then we talk about that overall robust climate change and energy. We talk about energy efficiency, renewable energy, solar energy. We talk about climate change and resiliency and vulnerability. And then we talk in our last week about what projects and how you can reach into your community more. And after COVID, we'll have more field trips. Next slide. So we also talk about those metrics. And what Kathleen talked about is trust. We show them the data. and what happens. This is an image showing you from 2005 to 2018. We've reduced our emissions by 18%. And you can see that green bar is the one that's had the most effect. And that's actually commercial buildings. And even though we have had more commercial square footage added to our city, that new commercial square footage is more efficient. So the amount of emissions from that is less. And we talk about the fact that we didn't do this all alone. This is part of the fact that our grid is not dependent on coal as much. It's moved from coal to natural gas and now more renewables in it. It's still not a huge chunk of renewable. That's happening over time. So we provide these facts to give people something to understand and help them engage, to know that everybody has to participate. The next slide. We tell people where the emissions come from: transportation, commercial buildings, residential buildings, solid waste, other things. And the point of this slide is to really give people an understanding of what locally happens to us. Commercial and residential buildings together are 57% of our emissions. That's more than transportation. And to understand that your actions at home and your actions in your office make a difference in the emissions. So sharing facts and truth, providing a profile of the city, again, reminding people that the city controls only 4% of the emissions, and that we also talk about transportation includes the city's portion of the subway system, trains and air travel that go to and from the city. Next slide. So I want to talk about ongoing opportunities. There are so many city commissions that you can participate in a city that are an engagement. I don't know if our city has the most commissions, but Kerry may know the exact number. I think it's less than 100, but more than 70. And those commissions might be the Park and Recreation Commission, the Beautification Commission. All these are opportunities to engage on sustainability. Our Energy and Climate Change Task Force is one of those examples that isn't a commission, but a short-term task force. And we have those too. We have one on flooding. Our Flood Action Ad Hoc Committee is one of those other opportunities that's not a commission that's ongoing in the city, but a short-term 1 to 2 year event. We give the Eco-City Academy twice a year. We encourage people with I share sustainability tips in the city to how to live and work in a sustainable environment every day. We engage in that development process that Kerry was talking about, how they engaged in the Arlandria small area plan. Well, I engage sustainability in all of those processes. So I try to cover and reach out to all the departments in the city so that I am really prioritizing sustainability everywhere. We also partner with a lot of different groups. Energy Masters Training and Volunteers is one example. There's a Virginia Cooperative Extension programs. So we really try to leverage resources and try to use other programs regionally to share our sustainability message and engage people. And I'll again mention that we need to engage that state policy, legislative, and national policies. And we have events. We find that events engage people, like Earth Day, Bike to Work Day, stream and park cleanups. These are all allow us to engage people as part of the process. We have Adopt a Street, Adopt a Park, we have like 6 Adopt a Garden. We have a lot of adopt a things. Next slide. So this is my question slide, but I want to talk briefly about what that picture shows. I think that sometimes when we talk about engaging people, especially in technological things, we have to make it understandable, just like we have to make it understandable by different languages. So Poppy, the dog, shows you when you're using a thermal camera, how a thermal camera works by just looking at this. A dog's nose is often the coolest part of the dog, so therefore it's blue, and the floor is cool, and it shows you the eyes that are white. That's the hottest part of the dog. So when you're using a thermal camera, I try to make our tools understandable by everybody. So that's really an example, and I'm sure I could learn from others how to do all of this better. But that's what I want to share, because many communities now have thermal cameras, and I've seen the instructions, and you need to bring that technology to an understandable way so that you're engaging people where they are. Thank you. That's all I have.
Fantastic. So we're going to open this now up for questions. I saw, and you probably all saw that I opened the chat box to see what was going on. And it looks like Art had a question for Carolyn. So why don't we lead off with that question? Carolyn, he's asking whether the citizen assemblies whether there are legal tools being used to ensure legitimacy of these citizen assemblies, and what are the mechanisms being used to implement recommendations and measuring results?
Both are great questions. In the case of what the British Parliament did with Extinction Rebellion in England, and what President Macron actually sponsored in France, I don't know that there was a legal mechanism beyond the legitimacy of the governing body making the invitation and agreeing to accept the results. I will find out a link to his organization, but a Canadian practitioner named Peter MacLeod has probably done more citizens' assemblies in a single country than anything that's been done any place in the world. And it's on lots of topics, not necessarily climate change. But I would guess Peter might have some examples of a different legal structure that supported, for example, it might have been part, if you put it in the US context, it might have been part of an initiative referendum that was done as a request by the public. But I will definitely get you Peter's contact information. Then critically, the implementation strategy and evaluation strategy has been, in all the cases that I know about in Europe, the government was responsible for implementation, but both in the case of the British Parliament and the French Parliament, they designed a way in which the advocacy groups that were working on the issue had a role in tracking how the progress of the parliament was, how much progress the parliament was making in actually implementing the recommendations. Now, this won't surprise anybody on the call, but in both cases, less got done in the time frames that were set out than, of course, the public wanted, or frankly, than the government agreed to. So there needs to be, as you would know well in the US context, the implementation process relative to both a parliament or a legislature and bureaucracies is a painfully slower process. I know anybody that is associated with the academy deeply understands that. So one of the counsel we always gave was to make sure that the government announced reasonable timeframes in which the public should watch for the key moments of implementation. Lots more I could say about this, but I also don't want to take up too much of the time in terms of, and again, I think the person who will know the most about legal structures is Peter MacLeod, and I'll make sure that Judy has his contact information so that you could reach out to him if you'd like to.
Terrific, Carolyn. Thank you. So I have two more hands raised right now. John Palguda.
Yeah, thank you. And Carolyn, Kerry, and Ellen, thank you all for an excellent presentation and overview. And I'm convinced, and I've seen your work, Carolyn, in practice, that when you can get the community into the room, whether it be a virtual room or an actual room, and you have shared priorities, wonderful things can happen. What concerns me is that it seems, and I'd love your reaction, it seems that it's becoming increasingly difficult in our very polarized society to get people into that room in the first place. You take any issue of importance and you have people, depending on the set of facts, quote unquote, that they choose to believe or where they get in their information, they're on different sides, and they're whether it's a shared priority or not depends. So environment's a great example, but also you take access to voting. You have people saying we've got to expand access, and others saying we have too much access, especially for the people who vote differently than I vote. Should we mask and distance? And that's well, no, my freedom means that I don't have to do those things. So I guess my question is, how do you Carolyn, you were talking about the critical elements for good engagement, which include shared priorities and everybody represented in the room. How do we get folks into the room on these important issues where you've got some folks who say it's just not a priority for me because it's not important, it's not real, what have you? How do we overcome that?
Let me respond quickly, and then you definitely should hear from Ellen and Kerry as well. This is what we really know from the work that all the organizations that are doing bridging work in the country, of which they've been popping up like crazy since 2016, is that the gap between the national narrative on how divided the American public is compared to reality at the community level is huge. If you listen to the national media, both traditional and social, you would believe you can't get Americans to talk about anything, whatever the topic might be. Well, if you look at both, Pew's got great research data on this, all of the bridging organizations, NICD, Everyday Democracy, Better Angels, fully 75% of Americans, 75%, know that where we are is very wrong and want to do something about it, but mostly don't feel comfortable or able to create the circumstances to have a conversation with a Republican or with a Democrat. Okay, we've got probably 12 to 15 on the far right, 10 to 12 on the far left, who forget what I just said. But to get where we need to get on these big issues that Kerry's working on, that Ellen's working on, we don't need those really radical elements in the room. In fact, we don't want them in the room. We want to create the spaces for that 75%. It's easier to attract them at the local level than it is at the national level for the obvious reasons that I just stated. But Judy, another source I'll get to you is real experimentation has been done by national bridge building groups, ran a process called America Talks, modeled on something done in Germany first called My Country Talks, where literally thousands of Americans of totally different political views agreed to spend an hour together just talking across the divide as human beings. That one didn't take it to an issue, but every person, like 93% of the people who participated said, okay, I want to talk about climate change next, or I want to talk about revising criminal justice issues next. So there's a hunger out there, and it is our mass media that is the biggest problem around getting people into the room.
Did you want to jump in, Kerry or Ellen? Yeah, thanks.
I did, because one of the things Carolyn said is really true for sustainability and climate change in general. We need participation from the public anyway, but we really want to go forward with those early adopters first. It would actually not be effective use of, per se, my time and a lot of people in this field to battle with people who don't believe the science. I think that just like other issues, they'll come around eventually by regulation and how homes are built and how different things happen. What we really need is we have to get to this more quickly than people realize. We need people to take action today. We need people to, actively turn out the lights they're not using. So what we really want to do is motivate the people who are more interested in this topic initially, and not focus on arguing or having a confrontational issue with the people who don't agree. So I would say my target audience most times is people who are open to doing something, and to get them more involved, get them more activated, have them become EcoCity ambassadors, so that they can then reach into their own networks and own communities and make some substantial changes. I really don't think for climate change and sustainability, it's beneficial for us to go into an audience that's combative. When I open my sessions and I talk about the science, and I use that as an introduction, I say, and I'm not here to argue the science. That is another forum, and it's not how I'm going to make changes for sustainability and climate change. That's kind of what I wanted to point out. I want to preach more to the choir.
Yeah. Well, and it's great to hear that. And I saw you all nodding when Carolyn was saying that, sure, they're the extremes, but the vast majority of the people are not with the same voice or with the same position as the extreme. And so we've got to deal with that large group of people who we really are not paying much attention to in the media, but are in fact are really the ones that carry the weight for the kind of change that you're trying to accomplish in your work and other work that we're hoping to do. So I loved that. Thank you. Quentin, you had
I just put Peter McLeod's email address into the chat. So those of you who'd like to pursue that a much deeper experience in Citizens Assembly around legality and implementation, I suggest you go to his website, and he would be happy to talk with you.
Fabulous. Thank you. So
Thank you.
Quentin.
I'd like to draw Alan into this conversation because Alan made the mistake of talking to me a couple of years ago on community indicators, if you remember. I was asking about that. And I know that Carolyn was involved in the National Indicators Project, because I saw your name. I thought, how come this woman I had never met in person shows up in these two areas that I thought I was really the only weirdo who's interested in both? And I guess this is kind of what I'm trying to get at, which is I just finished a book. Most of you know Kathy Newcomer at GW, and she was the lead author. And we finished a book that really was just supposed to be kind of a reformulation of all the performance improvement aspects of whether it's government, nonprofit, or social impact investing. And we did this presentation after the past administration decided you could have an equity-based presentation in December of last year. We had Data Foundation did one. We talked about it and said, how's this different? One of the questions at the end was, how's this different from anything else? I said, oh, well, probably not, because it's just a categorization of everything else. But there was one difference, and it was that every part of that framework we looked at had two parts. One was an engagement part, and one was an outcome and measure part. Outcome and measure people. I don't know how you turned out this way, Carolyn, because outcome and measure people do not think like engagement people. Okay, that's a total made up fact that I just wanted to throw out there as a hypothesis, but they're essential to working together. And I guess what I wondered is, Alan, thinking about the community indicators, and I'm now working with that organization, your Community Indicators Consortium, to try to figure out how could you shape engagement, a la what Carolyn presented, all these tools you might apply. And Ellen, I think, was talking about, or Kerry, were talking about all the strategies that were used in Alexandria to bring that together. I just wonder, your past work, Karen, with the indicators group from GAO time, and then with America Speaks. I know you know about the New Hampshire Listens people, and I've been talking to them about this. I just wonder how those two can both fit together, because frankly, I think the listening toward outcomes and measures is the missing link. And I don't know how to do it. We're trying to do a big project of that. I'd love to have anybody involved who's interested, but I just wonder what you think about the link between those two and how that might, because I'm a warm and fuzzy guy, even though I'm a left brain guy. I'm much more left brain, kind of data systems, structure, but it's tough. And I just realized you had to have both. You had to have that engagement and the indicators. And I just haven't seen a really good model of equal attention to both. And I wonder what anybody, actually Alan in particular, or Carolyn, but anybody might think about those two areas.
Well,
Alan?
I'll make one mention is that part of my work is tracking the impacts. So one of the things that happens is when we have our Solarize campaign, we track how many people we get to participate. So we know what who we're reaching, but we're also recognizing at this time that we haven't been reaching that underserved community. And we're trying to look at ways to get other funds that would help pay for those kinds of opportunities on the underserved community. So I think that we're measuring it. We're measuring it in how our emissions go down, how we're reaching people. But we're also measuring it in the people who participate in things. And even if it's something like a stream cleanup, and even if it's something like planting a tree, we're measuring it by how many people come out and what they do. One example that is a great measure in the City of Alexandria is we have an optional glass-only recycling, and you have to take it yourself to a big purple bin and drop it in. And we have really an expanding, rising curve of participation. And I've forgotten the number of millions of pounds that we've recycled so far. But it then comes back to us, and we tell the community, it comes back to us when we have that nuisance flooding, that we use that crushed glass as sand. So we're trying to close that communication loop to show them that when we gather the glass, it then pays us back by giving us free sand. And the other one we use is we gather like the Christmas trees and the leaves, and we mulch that, and then we give it back to the community as free mulch. So when we talk about how we're measuring that, we're trying to show people in the community that, but also close the loop so they feel that.
And that actually is a good example of, I think, the environmental, and I did a petition in the middle school at the first Earth Day for, doing something. And I worked on, you mentioned your early solar cell type of, or some of your environmental. I did a solar energy exposition in 1977 with a congressman I worked for, and it was all about pipes of hot water. It was really old time technology. So I'm for that, except you really, if you look at facts, the data, and if your goal is to reduce global warming, you got to get, a lot of this is going to require China and India and Russia. So we can do good things. I take it to our recycling center in our city. We have a curbside pickup now for a lot of the things, so we do that. But I think, I'm just talking about guiding and prioritize. There was a comment made about other outcomes besides environmental, because I see, when I've engaged people with this, it almost always ends up with something like health or transportation or, somewhat related to environment, but not specifically. Sorry about that. Carolyn, you were going to.
Well, and Alan, please also jump in here. I want to share both a piece of history about America Speaks and what I see happening right now. Since the Trump election, the explosion of what are called bridge building organizations in the US is astonishing. Literally hundreds, and many of them started just by people in the public who know how wrong this is. So we've created a steering committee of more than 100 of these organizations, and we've divided up into specific work that deeply needs to be done, one of which is evaluation and metrics. And two people, Kristen Hansen and Bruce Bond, have led this. There's a new philanthropic consortium called New Pluralism that has given this steering committee a grant to actually build these evaluation metrics. And what we're doing is going to all the bridge building organizations and asking them to be pilots to use these evaluation metrics. This one I can't do quickly in the chat, but I will get a link to it and get it to Judy, because having been in this field for 30 years, there is currently a closer connection between practitioners of all kinds and a desire and willingness to link it directly to evaluation and metrics, both about how it transforms individuals, which is really important, and how it actually impacts the outcomes of what the topic is. The quick story about America Speaks. When we did our last national discussion, which was in 2010 on debt and deficit, and all of you are political enough to remember that that was the big Tea Party revolution, and deficit was the most important topic in the 2010 election. We did 3,600 Americans, absolutely demographically matching the country. Harvard and Berkeley were given a MacArthur grant to do a blind study match of our 3,600 participants. And this is a link, Judy, this report is still up on the web. We had 97% participation in our participants, and the data is amazing what it shows in terms of how they change. All the self-identified conservatives in the morning said, won't raise any taxes, won't raise any fees, nothing, nothing, nothing. All the liberals said, we will not cut entitlements under any circumstances. It takes a bright fourth grader about 45 minutes to figure out you can't do it without doing both. It took our adults about an hour and a half, but they figured it out, and they cut $26 trillion from the deficit by 2025, which was what a special group from the House of Representatives was supposed to do and did not accomplish.
Wow. Wow. So Alan, do you want to jump in and say anything, add to anything that's been said?
Well, no, except, Quentin, when you were talking about community indicators, actually community engagement and community indicators are rooted together. A lot of the local community indicators projects around the country between Boston and Austin and Jacksonville and King County and others, in order to identify what needed to be measured, what were the values of that community in order to be measured, all came through community engagement processes. So they wouldn't have done it without the community engagement and reporting out. What I think what the gap was about the implementation and not having the community engage in the implementation and moving it forward from that. Where Alan talked about the ambassadors, those types of things I think are the gaps that get missed in that process. It's like we bring them to the table, say, give us all your good ideas and everything else, and we go, thanks, and we'll let you know how the process is going, rather than saying, here, now go do it. So to me, it's not the engagement process, it's in the building, it's the engagement process in the implementation that is the missing link.
Yeah. And the other thing I would add to that, because of the work that I'm doing, which is it's totally unrelated to climate change, somewhat unrelated to civic engagement in a broad sense. I do employee engagement. And the point that Alan just made is something we hear over and over and over in organizations. We don't ask the employees what they think. We don't ask employees to help us with problem solving. We don't ask employees to get engaged. And as a result, they don't feel engaged and they don't participate. And so part of the problem most organizations have is that when they do open themselves up to trying to listen, trying to create a safe space for people to come forward and speak, they listen, but they don't prove that they've listened in a way that they've done something as a result of what they heard. And so I was curious, as Kerry and Ellen were talking, about the closed loop. So for the participants, not just the wonderful academy and the ambassadors, but how do we make sure that people know that what they communicated actually was heard and something happened because of what they said in those efforts. So I think that's the key for people to keep coming back, because what I hear in organizations is, my God, they ask me all the time, but they don't do anything. So why should I respond to surveys? Why should I participate? Because I know they're not going to listen to me anyway. And I think we have to be really careful when we do civic engagement kinds of things, that people feel that it's worth their time and attention, especially when Carolyn was talking about those illegal immigrants. I mean, they needed to not only have a safe space where they could speak, but they needed to know that people actually did something with what they took the risk to share, because in the end, if we don't even listen to them and don't do anything as a result of them, we've really lost a lot of trust.
And those
Yeah,
tend to be
absolutely.
what I kept hearing was that people didn't feel that they were heard. Either they didn't feel they were heard. Even Alan, what you're talking about, most of the communities, it was kind of expertise in the active members of the community. It wasn't like Carolyn and Ellen were talking about drilling down into getting people who aren't usually involved. That's not a slam. That's just, I think, just a tendency. And the other piece was they didn't want to participate when you talk to them because nothing ever happened. They'd been surveyed and people had asked them over the years, so it's a combination of both the engagement and the results that somehow I think this is asking the right question, especially.
Alan.
Yeah, we've actually have gone through an evolution in the engagement process, because it used to be let's set the meeting up, let's have it, and whoever comes. I've seen over the last 5 years, it's like, no, we got to go out and, as Carolyn and Kerry and Ellen were talking about, get those trusted organizations and have them invite the participants. Rather than just some government organization or group saying, oh, come on, sit down and talk with us. So this has been kind of a change I've seen in the last 5 years, locally and nationally in the thinking. So we've gone from, if you build it, they'll all come, to no. And you also have to move it. We have a wonderful thing here in Alexandria. It's like the difference between the East End and the West End. It seems like, Ellen talked about it's 15 square miles, but when you talk about if something's in the East End, it seems like it's 100 miles away. But by moving the community engagement processes around to where people are, that gives them a better opportunity to be more engaged in using different tools as well. So it's been much more of an evolution in the engagement aspect of it.
Well, I have a ton more questions, but I'm very mindful I'm losing the audience a little bit because we try to stick to our time frame, and we said we would end at 7:30. This was terrific. I'm so happy that you were willing to let us record you guys, because I'm hoping that people will listen to or watch this recording and also look at the different resources that you gave both on your slides as well as what Carolyn has so generously said she would share with us. I mean, there's so much that I'm taking away from this conversation that's really rich, and I'm excited that we've had an opportunity to have you guys come and talk to us about this. It's just wonderful, to be honest with you, that we have people like the three of you women out there doing this kind of work. And I don't mean that as a gender thing, although you happen to be three women. I don't mean it as a gender thing. I just mean that there are three people out there with the kind of work that you guys are doing. It's really refreshing and wonderful. Even after 30 years, Carolyn, it's still refreshing to know that you're fighting the good fight all the time. And so thank you so much for what you all do and for participating in this.
Thank you for having us. This
Yes,
has been
thank
really
you for
interesting.
having us, and great
And I
fun
will-
to hear what's
Yes.
happening in Alexandria, just across the river.
Right. I will say, if you have any questions or want more, you can go to the EcoCity website. You can email me directly. I can answer questions about this all day.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And
Thank
thank you
you.
for those of you that participated in listening too. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Have wonderful holidays.